when I got here and when I started doing the degree, I had a vague idea what chemical engineering was, but in all honesty, I'd done maths, physics and chemistry. I knew I was quite good at maths, physics and chemistry. I enjoyed chemistry, so I thought, right, great, chemical engineering. When I got here, I realised that I wasn't quite as good at chemistry as I thought I was. I thought I was going to be really strong on that, and I wasn't as good as I thought I was. And also the maths. It was actually a really challenging course. I'm sure it's still a really challenging course. I thought I was very, very good at maths. And then I think we got to about the end of the first year where we did the first part with the mathematicians, I think, at the time. And the maths suddenly got to a level where it was way beyond what I'd ever dreamed. But I did really enjoy the variety, I guess, of the course, and the whole, it was very, very challenging, but really, really interesting, and yeah, it was just a great time. London in the 1980s was super fun. We probably university life was a little bit more relaxed maybe than it is now. I'm not sure, but we were, we managed to get quite a lot of London life in as well as lectures. So it was a good balance from that point of view. We had lots of exciting clubs, lots of really cool music in the 1980s. And the student union used to put some fantastic gigs on with very cheap drink. So yeah, it was fun, really, really good fun. So having looked around the university today, in some ways it's unrecognisable because it's so much shinier and newer, and the facilities are amazing, I think, compared to what we had. But the fundamentals of it actually are very familiar. Looking at the pictures of the labs and things, they still look very familiar to me. And actually coming back to this area, which I haven't been back to often, all the memories come flooding back. So I think the things that have changed out of all recognition are probably on the technology side. The amazing advances in sort of computing, and now you have AI and computers and calculators. We didn't have calculators when I was doing my engineering degree. We had slide rules. So some of it's changed out of all recognition, mostly around, I think, sort of technology, but some of it still looks very familiar. And a lot of the processes are actually very much the same. So I graduated in 1984. That was actually quite a difficult time for engineering. There weren't an enormous number of engineering jobs at that time. I think at the time I thought I wanted to carry on and actually be a chemical engineer in a chemical plant somewhere and work for maybe one of the big chemical companies at the time. Wasn't that easy at the time to actually achieve that. So I sort of spoke to a number of different companies actually, but I ended up deciding to join an accountancy firm. So I joined what is now KPMG. At that time it was called Peter Marwick, and I joined them and qualified as a chartered accountant. Did all the things that you would normally do as a chartered accountant, did some auditing, did some accounting, but I ended up doing quite a lot of work around corporate finance, so around raising money for companies. And I also got offered the opportunity to go and do a secondment at the London Stock Exchange, which was not something that I knew anything about. Stock Exchange, was a world I knew nothing of. But one thing I do think is, like, if you're offered an opportunity, you should take it. So I went and did a secondment at the London Stock Exchange, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And the role there was in something called the listing department, and your job there is to look at companies that want to join the stock market, that want to raise money, generally, And so you end up seeing pretty much every company that's listed that's doing anything you're involved with. So I did that for a couple of years, enjoyed it, went back to KPMG and did corporate finance for a bit. And then I was asked to go back to the exchange and run that department. So I did that for about 6 years. And then I decided I would move into, I guess, the other side of the fence. So instead of being a regulator, to be a stockbroker. So I left and I joined a company called Cazenove and did corporate finance there for a few years. And then I ended up working for a couple of large investment banks, one of which is UBS, which is a big Swiss bank. Joined them and I ended up in a slightly different role. I was their head of compliance for Europe, which was again an interesting role. You sit alongside the board. You see all of the transactions that are going on in the bank at the time, and you advise them on regulation. Really, did that for UBS for nearly 10 years, and then I went to do a very similar role for Nomura, who are a big Japanese bank. Very similar job, different culture. Quite interesting to see the differences between sort of the Swiss European culture and the Japanese culture. Both roles were based in London, but ended up sort of travelling quite a bit with both of those. And then more recently, so back in 2016 now we're talking, I was asked if I would be interested to go and do a role as a non-executive director, which I did. And then since then I've built up a portfolio of different companies, so I now sit on a number of boards, which is nice because it's quite a variety of things. You get to see different companies, different management teams all the time, and it's a bit of a better lifestyle. It's not sort of 24/7 anymore. It's a little bit more relaxed, so I'm really thoroughly enjoying that. I think an engineering degree, and a particular chemical engineering degree, is always going to be attractive to people in the finance space and in investment banking in particular. The banks are always looking to take, the brightest and the best. And I think when you've done a degree like chemical engineering, you've proved your intellectual capacity. You've proved that you can work really hard because there's a lot of hours and a lot of study involved in chemical engineering. And I think a lot of the skills are transferable. We see in banking particularly, we see a lot of engineers and PhDs and lots of different variety of backgrounds. Quite often people end up in, I guess, in the more analytical roles within the banks. So very often within the research departments. So instead of designing processes for chemical engineering, you might end up researching interesting chemical companies that are out there that are listed, or pharmaceutical companies. Again, a lot of people go into research and specialise in those sectors where their degree has given them quite a lot of knowledge. I think also in the risk space, you see quite a lot of engineers in that risk space because you've got a good analytical brain and you're good at assessing risks and likely outcomes, so you see that quite a lot. But I think it's definitely a space which is always going to be welcoming to people with that background. So I think one of the skills that you learn when you're at university and when you're doing your degree, and particularly when it's one that's as challenging as an engineering degree, is the ability to learn. Again, one thing that I took, I think, from my time here is the ability to assimilate really large amounts of information in a fairly short space of time, and be able to sort of sift that and come to a conclusion and come to a view on it. So I think it's not being frightened of large amounts of information and data is one thing. And I think another thing that I found in my career, which I think is for me anyway, is a really important one, is if you want to progress in your career, you sort of have to be not afraid to walk away from what you've just learnt. So just because you just spent 3 years or 5 years or however many years it is learning something, doesn't mean that you have to keep hanging on to it forever. You know you can do that, so you can go and learn something new and you can go and do something different. And I think I probably found that a bit with my engineering degree, but also maybe a bit more even with having qualified as an accountant. You spend so much time and so much effort sort of learning all of this and passing all these exams that the idea of then not using it is quite scary. But it hasn't been wasted. And you can go on and do other things as well. So I think, you know, that's one of my sort of learning points over my career, is not be too hung up on not giving up on what I've just done. Because if you do that, I think you sort of close routes that you might have open. So just being able to be open to opportunities and try different things, I think, is really important. Looking back to my university days, and I'm sure it's the same now, we had a lot of international students. We had students from all over the world, and you know, in other circumstances, you don't get that opportunity. You don't get that opportunity to mix with people from so many different backgrounds and so many different places. And I think it's really important, and to make the most of those opportunities. It's a brilliant network because you meet people that you're going to hopefully know for quite a long time, and you'll keep in touch with them and you go and visit them in all the marvellous places they come from. But people will come up with completely different reactions to the same thing because of their backgrounds, and it's really interesting seeing that and how that plays out. So I think that was a really positive part of the university and that environment, because I think we forget, because we're very privileged in what we've been able to do. Lots of people don't get that opportunity. They don't get the opportunity to have that diversity and that mix of people that they interact with. And the roles that I do now, sitting on boards, one of the big subjects that we're always sort of striving towards is to get diversity, because there does tend to be a tendency sometimes for boards to look a bit the same. And getting that diversity of background, diversity of thought, diversity of ethnicity, of gender, they're all equally important in my view to get the right mix. We all bring something different to the table. So I think if I could talk to my younger self, I would tell myself to be much more confident in my own ability. I think people often doubt themselves, or we all suffer from imposter syndrome. You're sure that somebody's going to find out that actually you're just blagging it. You don't really know what you're talking about, and often that stops you maybe putting yourself forward for that job that you would actually have been really good at if you'd just been brave enough to go for it. And the same sort of things I think can apply whether you're thinking of going to university, where you're thinking of going to university. Don't limit yourself too much by self-doubt. So do go for the job, do go for the upgrade, do go for the what it is that you really want to do. So I would definitely say that to my younger self. And I think the other thing I would say to my younger self is just embrace everything that's out there, because do things while you've got the chance to do them, because you never know what's around the corner.